Back in 2007, I started my tech job at a long-haul IP company called DT1. That place doesn't exist anymore. And honestly, I have no idea how they stayed in business as long as they did. It was basically a pyramid scheme. Luckily, I worked in IT, so I didn't have to sell anything. It was just a small tech support call center. Customers would call in, or sometimes Verizon or Quest would reach out to report that DT1's lines were down, or there was a power outage. I was the only woman on the team, constantly having to prove myself and show I could handle anything, while my male co-workers didn't seem to need nearly as much time to earn the same respect. After working with Marcus, I decided to take the night shift. 10-hour stretches from Wednesday to Saturday, 1 p.m. to midnight with an hour for lunch. After 6 p.m., I was completely alone in the entire building. Everyone else bolted out of the office at 6 sharp, which was wild. I couldn't blame them, though. I chose 3 days off over 2, but like I said, I was on my own most of the night. I had to keep an eye on emails and make sure I answered the phone. The shifts were slow. I'd finish a ton of video games, read school assignments, and write during that time. Sometimes, though, I'd just wander around the building walking to get away from my desk for a bit. I'd forward the voiceless phone system to my cell so I wouldn't miss any calls. Gave me the freedom to grab a soda or some food. One time, when I stepped away from my desk, I headed down to the lunchroom to get a soda from the vending machine in the basement. The basement had a wall of windows and a security door just like the main entrance. There was only one camera pointed at that door, but nothing else really made you feel secure. I didn't like going down there much. The back of the building faced a pitch-black acre of woods. There was a walking path into the forest, but for some reason they never put lights on it. No clue why, but it didn't help with the creepy vibe. Sometimes I'd see animals darting by, but other times it felt like someone was watching me. I always tried to hurry when grabbing a soda or snack, though sometimes it didn't feel fast enough. So, one night, I was heading down to the basement for a soda. It was a dragging shift and I needed some caffeine to stay sharp. I counted my change as I walked, making sure I had enough to get in and out quick. But out of the corner of my eye, something darted from the glass door back into the darkness. I froze mid-step and scanned the woods with my eyes, but like I said, it was just a void of black. Unease crept in, and every instinct told me to turn around and head back to my desk. But it was only 9 p.m. I still had a chunk of my shift left before I could clock out and leave this popsicle stand. I shook off the feeling, hurried to the vending machine and made my pick. The soda clunked down, and as I bent to grab it, a loud ping rang out, like someone had slammed something against the glass. I shot upright, the hairs on my neck standing on end. Slowly, I turned, dreading the sight of someone out there, but when I fully faced the door, it was just darkness again. That was my cue to book it back to the main floor. I didn't bother with the elevator. I hit the stairs and bolted up, my heart already pounding from going down there in the first place, then the loud bang, and now sprinting up 2 flights. Back at my desk, I sank into my chair and tried to calm down. It was just a noise, I told myself. I was in a locked building with secure interior offices. I kept repeating that in my head. Nothing to worry about. Relief started to settle in, but then that watched feeling hit me again. I glanced up at the cubicle wall and scanned the office, nothing out of place, until I turned toward the front of the building. Beyond the first row of doors, there he was. A tall, lanky, grimy-looking guy. He had his hands cupped around his eyes, trying to peer through the reflection of the indoor lights. I ducked back into my cubicle before he could spot me. He didn't look like anyone I'd ever seen around the office, and it was past 9 p.m. No legit reason for him to be scoping out my workspace. As I sat there, I heard the doors rattle. I stood up slowly and saw him yanking on the handles. They didn't budge and I breathed a little easier. But when I looked at him again, he turned and faced me. His face looked bruised or filthy, I couldn't tell. And when his eyes locked onto mine, he started pounding harder, slamming his fists against the glass. I was terrified. It was the middle of the night. I was alone and stuck in this office complex. I grabbed my headset and dialed 911. As the dispatcher picked up, the guy paced back and forth outside the glass. 911, what's your emergency? The woman's voice was sharp and to the point. Hi, my name's Natalie, and I work at the Spectrum IT Services building. I need someone out here. There's a guy trying to break into my office. While I was talking, he vanished from sight. I tried looking every which way, but he was gone. I knew he wouldn't just leave, not after banging that hard. Then, out of nowhere, a huge rock smashed into the door. I yelped and dove under my desk. The dispatcher asked what happened, and I told her a rock had hit the glass. She asked if it broke enough for him to get in. I didn't want to stand up and check, but she urged me to look so we'd know where he was. I crawled out from under the desk, peeked over the cubicle wall, and saw a massive crack at the top of the door. I dropped back down and begged her to hurry the police along. She said they were on their way. I'd read stories like this before, people saying the cops can't get there fast enough, and they weren't kidding. Time felt frozen, and I was helpless. Another bang hit the door, followed by the sound of shattering glass. The alarm blared as sirens closed in on the building, music to my ears. I told the dispatcher the police had arrived and thanked her for all her help. Standing up, I peeked over the cubicle wall. Red and blue lights flashed wildly outside, but the guy was nowhere in sight. The top half of the door was completely smashed, and the rock lay inside the entrance. One cop stepped through the front door while others searched the area outside. I could see their flashlights sweeping the parking lot. The first officer was kind and patient, letting me explain everything I'd seen. Soon after, my boss showed up to check on me and assess the damage. At some point, my husband was called, and I told him I'd be escorted home by one of the officers. I took the next few days off and started looking for a new job. No more solo night shifts. When I gave my statement, I told the police the guy might have been linked to an old co-worker who'd been fired a few weeks earlier for stealing and no showing. He knew when people came and went. He knew where we kept the mobile phones we sold. Not under lock and key, but stashed under the vendor's desk. Smartphones, Blackberries when they were still a thing, tablets, headsets, phone cards, you name it. I quit that job a month later and started working at a credit card machine company. It was still a call center, but the office was packed with people. With security systems and cameras everywhere, I felt safer. Like I said, DT1's long gone, bought out by another company that liquidated anything worth a dime. As for that grimy guy who tried breaking into my office, let's never cross paths again. Back when I was young and prone to chasing every dollar at all hours of the night, I picked up a side gig as an Uber driver. This was on top of my full-time job in retail, working the counter and selling stuff, though it didn't pay what I needed at the time. I wasn't sharp enough to land a better job or just negotiate a raise. Instead, I did what a lot of us working kids do these days. Took on a second hustle. I lived in a big city, drove a nicer car I enjoyed cruising around in, so Uber made sense. I remember this was about 10 years ago when the company had already taken off and was making waves nationwide. You'd hear about folks pulling in six-figure salaries just ferrying people around their communities. Everyone I chatted with randomly told me the same thing. It was easy money, and you could rake in a ton. I can't say I didn't make a decent chunk with this side gig, but it didn't double my income like I'd hoped. It did, however, push me to a whole new level of exhaustion. I was sacrificing sleep to make those Uber runs more efficient, which meant I was going all day. I'd clock out of the retail store around 5 p.m., grab a quick bite, then drive Uber until about 2 a.m. Anything past that? I quickly learned it was just the riffraff crowd, and this was back when Uber didn't have the protocols they do now. It wasn't unheard of for some pretty wild stuff to go down in the back seats of those cars. Fast forward a bit, I'd been at this new gig for 6 months. I'd gotten used to working double shifts, figuring out the high productivity zones for pickups and how to turn around fast at drop-offs to get back to the downtown core. If you took a wrong turn, you'd end up on the opposite side, where it's all commercial parks and businesses. You'd have to do these weird loops, wasting time and gas. There was a hospital downtown where I'd occasionally pull over nearby. It had a huge lot, and with its sprawling parking area, I could rest there, check my phone without worrying about the hustle of traffic, even catch a few winks if I needed to. Plus, there were fast food joints and convenience stores nearby. Everything to keep me in the game. I'd grab a Red Bull or something every now and then, but not too often. Still, I found myself at the tail end of a burnout cycle. I was definitely nearing my limit. One night during that red line phase, I stuck to my usual routine and pulled into the hospital lot while waiting for riders. It was an unusually slow night. I'd been banking on a lot of passengers, so I didn't know what to do with myself. I'd gone to grab an energy drink from a vending machine in the lobby to make some extra cash that night. Didn't matter. I got back in the driver's seat, turned on my favorite playlist, and passed out right there. I didn't sleep long, but it was one of those deep, drooling, mouth-open, mouth-breathing naps. Me at my absolute worst. The one thing I hated more than anything was that feeling of waking up when I shouldn't have been asleep. My brain would kick into overdrive right away. I couldn't make any connections despite all the sparks firing. I couldn't remember where I was, who I was, or what I was doing. Back in high school, when teachers caught me nodding off, I'd jolt awake and couldn't even speak proper English. Just made weird noises and sat there in silence, trying to piece it all together. This was one of those times. I woke myself up because my head was at some awkward angle. I let out this groan as I came back to the real world. Still in my car, still night, same damn playlist blaring through the speakers. I glanced at the clock. Only out for about 15 minutes. Took a deep breath through my nose and sat up. A perfect power nap's supposed to give you more energy than a long sleep, right? I checked my phone. Hadn't missed anything, but there was a rider nearby I could scoop up for a few bucks. I took another swig of my drink, checked the mirror, and shifted into drive. But I paused. Something was off in the rear view. If I wasn't mistaken, there was someone sitting right behind me, smack in the middle seat. Our eyes locked. I whipped around, and sure as daylight, there was a guy sitting less than 3 feet from me. He gave a faint smile and a little nod, like he was acknowledging I'd been asleep. Almost a small hello. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to scream in his face to get out. Part of me wanted to act tough. And another part just wanted to ask what the hell he was doing in my car. Then I glanced down and saw the Uber app open on his phone. I remembered the sticker on my window, that I was parked outside a hospital. This guy probably wandered out of one of those buildings, booking a ride, and stumbled across me. For whatever reason, his phone snapped me back to just enough clarity to ease the panic, so I just said, "Hey, what are you doing in my car?" He didn't answer right away, just looked at the floor, then the ceiling, not straight at me. I gestured toward his phone and went on, "You looking for a ride or something?" He nodded. All right, at least he's half normal, I thought. I rambled on a bit, buckling my seatbelt, explaining, like I'm explaining to you now, that I work 2 jobs, I'm exhausted, and I happened to fall asleep. I said I'd be happy to give him a lift in exchange for a good review, one that didn't mention I'd been napping in the car. We both chuckled at that. I was aiming for downtown. He said he was heading back to Mason Drive, a main road through the area. I asked for specifics and he gave me vague directions but mentioned it was near an old music venue that shut down years ago. I knew the spot, so I started the route. We made small talk, mostly about me and how I'd dozed off. His name was Kieran, he said. He'd meant to say something when he got in but saw me snoring and decided to wait. I was grateful he wasn't a creep. I told him I'd nearly lost it before I saw his Uber app. Then it hit me. This guy and I hadn't actually connected. He hadn't booked a ride through the app, and I hadn't logged in to pick anyone up. I shot him a quick glance in the rear view and said, "Oh wait, I just realized this trip's not registered. Can you find me on the app real quick?" That's when he smirked, looked out the window and said, "Oh, I'm not paying for this." I laughed, but he stayed quiet. Things got a little awkward. I glanced back again, realizing the mistake I'd just made. This guy wasn't dressed like a professional, not your typical business casual. He was filthy, torn clothes, only one shoe, face smudged and dark from sun exposure. There was a grimy backpack next to him. He was homeless, had to be. While I was out cold, some drifter wandering the hospital lot must have climbed into my car, thinking he could crash there or worse. But on a second look, I noticed something. Kieran was wearing a wristband, the paper kind they give you at hospitals for discharge. This guy had probably OD'd behind a dumpster, got doped up, and now scored a free ride back to his drug den just because I couldn't keep my eyes open. I shook my head, flicked on my blinker, and started heading for the next exit. "Where you going?" he asked from the back. "I told you where we're going," I snapped. "I'm not driving you across town for free, buddy. You're lucky I'm not even calling the cops." I grabbed my phone from the cup holder beside me, just to show him I wasn't messing around. "Yeah," Kieran shot back. "You're lucky. I didn't yank my shoelace off and strangle you before you could blink." I felt his rough hands slide behind the headrest, and instinctively, they clamped around my throat. I let go of the wheel with one hand, trying to pry him off, but no, dice. I could only wedge a finger under his palm to get a sliver of breathing room. Panic surged as I watched the seconds tick by on the dash. I tried shoving him off, could hear his wheezing breath right behind me. The stench from his hands and mouth was vile. This guy hadn't showered in at least a week, maybe more. Finally, I figured out how to shake him loose. I checked the mirror, alone on this stretch of highway, then slammed the brakes hard. I was buckled in. Kieran behind me wasn't so lucky. He crashed forward into my seat, loosening his grip just enough. I yanked with my other hand, breaking his hold, then swerved onto the shoulder. Now Kieran was scrambling, trying to grab me again, but I wasn't letting that happen twice. We wrestled a bit. I threw the car into park, flipped on the hazards, and said screw it. This had gone too far. I dialed 911, hit call, and pressed the phone to my ear. He started stumbling out, throwing more threats, but he was getting out of my car. That's when I noticed he was holding a wallet. A nice one. He grumbled, slung his backpack over his shoulder, and stepped into the cool night air. Then he started walking down the shoulder, down the exit ramp back toward the city. I heard the dispatcher in my ear and realized I couldn't let this slide. I started spilling everything that had just happened, where I was, where he was headed. As I described the scene, the dispatcher went quiet for a second, maybe muted me, then came back with new info just a minute later. She said my report matched one from earlier, from the very hospital I'd parked at. Turns out Kieran had been admitted just like I'd suspected. While there, he got incoherent, agitated, And when he realized he wasn't being watched, he unhooked himself from the machines, threw his clothes back on, and bolted from the hospital, but not before swiping a wallet from one of the rooms in his ward. The owner noticed it missing soon after and reported it to hospital security. They checked the cameras, and it didn't take long to spot this guy walking out the front doors with the woman's wallet in hand. From there, he started zigzagging through the parking lot until he got to my running car. I figure Kieran thought he could steal it until he saw me asleep inside. Then he just slipped into the back to hide from any potential hospital security. No need to say Donovan's night went downhill after he left my car. I told the dispatcher where I was and where he was headed, even followed him down the ramp I bit. I hadn't gone 2 blocks before a cop rolled up, lights and sirens blaring, and cuffed him. That phone I'd seen in his hand? It was the woman's. He'd found it in her wallet. He was trying to book an Uber in case I didn't wake up. Talk about perfect timing for those guys. I gave my statement to the cops who hauled him off. I'd bet he spent a few weeks sobering up in a cell. I probably don't need to say this, but lock your car doors, folks. I'm a woman, and I work as a bartender in the city. It's a job I've had for 3 years now, and I genuinely enjoy it. I live in an apartment building just a few blocks away from the bar where I work. I've had a few creepy experiences. Over the years, most of them not too bad, but the scariest one happened about a year ago. I usually work late until around 2 or 3 a.m., and one night things were especially busy. At the bar where I work, the sidewalk out front is typically bustling with people passing by. It was maybe 1 a.m., and this guy walked by on the sidewalk. He stopped and stared through the window. From where I stood behind the counter, I could see pretty clearly through the big front window. The guy was wearing old sunglasses and a hat, but it felt like he was looking right at me. He just stood there staring inside. I noticed him and thought it was a little odd, but I kept working. I was swamped and didn't have time to dwell on it. After a while, I figured he'd left because I didn't see him anymore. But then later, he came back and stared at me through the window again. This time, it was during a quieter moment, and I realized how strange it was. I looked at him as he looked at me. No wave, no gesture, just staring. He was maybe a foot from the glass. After 2 or 3 minutes of this, I saw him walk off. He never came inside the bar, and I didn't recognize him, though with the sunglasses in the darkness, I couldn't see him all that well. Plus, I've met thousands of people over the years as a bartender. That night, when I got off work around 3 a.m., I walked home like I always do. The streets were nearly empty by then, even though this is a busy city. Normally, it takes me about 10 minutes to walk to and from work. Halfway home, I was on the sidewalk, passing an alley, and as I went by, I noticed someone standing in it, about 50 feet away. It's creepy to see someone standing in a dark alley at that hour. Instinctively, I glanced over and realized it was the same guy, still wearing those weird, outdated sunglasses. They weren't quirky in a funny way. They were just old and off-putting. He was just standing there doing nothing but staring at me as I passed. I sped up, walking faster. I couldn't believe I was seeing him again. This is a big city with tons of people living here. I started wondering if he somehow knew I'd be walking by. I kept my eyes peeled to see if he'd follow me out of the alley. I was nervous, fumbling around for my mace just to feel safer as I walked. Looking back, I saw he didn't come out of the alley, though I kept checking over my shoulder. I made it home without being followed, and I felt relieved. I'd walked home late so many times before at all sorts of hours, and nothing sketchy had ever happened. Once I got home, I was exhausted and got ready for bed. My apartment's on the 5th floor, so I'm pretty high up. I turned off the lights before sleeping and glanced out the window. I've got a great view of the city and I like looking around. But then I looked down at the street. There he was on the sidewalk, staring up at me. I jumped back from the window and quickly covered it with the curtains. I had no idea how this guy knew where I lived, let alone which apartment was mine. I was terrified. In the days that followed, I felt a little paranoid. I told some friends and coworkers about it. None of them had any idea who the guy might be, but they were worried for my safety. They suggested I consider calling the police, especially if I saw him again. But I didn't see him for a while. Maybe 2 or 3 weeks passed, and I started to forget about the whole thing. Then one night, after getting home from work and getting ready for bed, I was in the bathroom washing my face when I thought I heard a noise coming from the hallway in my apartment, just outside the front door. With the water running near my head, I couldn't hear clearly, but I turned it off and listened. That's when I heard the doorknob on my front door being turned. Thankfully, it was locked. There was a pause, maybe 30 seconds, then a knock on my door. I knew it was him, instantly. Everything came rushing back, and at that hour, I couldn't imagine it being anyone else. I crept toward the door, slow and quiet, and looked through the peephole. Sure enough, it was him standing right outside my apartment. I wondered how he'd even gotten into the building. As I stepped away, he knocked again. I slipped into my bedroom, went into the closet, and called 911. I tried to stay as quiet as possible while explaining what was happening and that I felt in danger. They told me an officer would be there soon. While I waited, I hoped he wouldn't try to break in or anything. I tiptoed back to my bedroom door and listened. I heard him try the doorknob again, then knock once more. After that, there was silence for 2 or 3 minutes. I thought maybe he'd left, so I went back to the front door and looked out again. He was still there, standing just on the other side. Even now, thinking about seeing him through the peephole so close gives me chills. I quietly returned to my bedroom and waited. A little while later, I heard more voices outside my door in the hallway. I went back and looked out again. This time I saw the guy talking to a police officer as they walked down the hall. Soon after, an officer knocked on my door to speak with me. Apparently, the guy had made up some story, claiming he thought I'd dropped money on the ground while walking home and was trying to return it to me. That was an obvious lie. I hadn't dropped any money. After that, I never saw him again. I still don't know exactly how he figured out where I lived, other than that he must have followed me home at some point without me noticing. He must have also watched my building to see me through the window before I realized it. It's really unsettling to think about. A year before the world turned upside down, I got hired at a call center in the heart of the city. We took calls for a roadside assistance company whose identity I'll keep under wraps. Honestly, the last time I looked them up, I couldn't even find their website. For all I know, they might not even be in business anymore, but given the nature of our industry, that wouldn't surprise me. Our office ran 24 hours a day. It wasn't some massive private operation, just a ground floor corner unit in a commercial office building. We shared the space with about 10 or 12 other businesses, all of which operated during regular hours. By 5 p.m., the parking lot would clear out, and the only light came from our little outpost. There was no signage, just a keypad on the door for 24/7 access. Shifts changed at 4 p.m., midnight, and 9 a.m. Usually, it was a 2-person crew, sometimes 3 or 4 during the week or on holiday weekends. The night shift was often just one guy, Marcus, but on holiday weekends they'd schedule 2 of us. We'd work from midnight to 9 a.m. I think it was Labor Day weekend. Marcus and I were handling the phones on the Friday night shift. I never minded picking up those shifts because, truth be told, I liked working with the guy. He was a bit older than me and had the wildest stories I'd ever heard. He grew up in the city, ran with a rough crowd back in the day, but had since cleaned up his act and was trying to break into the music business. I'm into drawing and illustrating, and he loved checking out whatever I was working on at the time. We'd just hang out, messing around until the sun came up. Sometimes we'd even troll people over the phone if they were spamming us or dodging their bills. Looking back, those dark hours were a strange kind of fun. Dreamy, almost. One night, we ordered Domino's, pizza and some breadsticks. Legendary meal for a couple of guys stuck in a phone room. Back then, in my early 20s, I had no clue I was slowly becoming lactose intolerant. All that cheese and butter hit my stomach and colon like a freight train. We ate around midnight, talked, and worked until about 1:30 a.m. By 2 a.m., I started burping and I knew something was brewing on the other end. I told Marcus what was up so he could cover the phones for me. I slipped out the door, the only way in or out of the office. No secondary exit, no back door, just a big window at the rear. Thinking back, that place almost felt illegal. A lot about the setup was shady, as you might imagine. With so many office units in the building, we all shared one pair of restrooms. They were on the ground floor, outside the office, with doors open to the public. Everyone who worked there had a key to unlock one or both. They were tucked about 40 feet down a hallway around a corner, hidden in a little nook beneath the second floor. That kept them out of sight so random weirdos or creeps wouldn't try to use them or trash the place. I got in there wrestling, with digestive issues I didn't fully understand yet, then washed my face. As I was staring in the mirror, I heard someone shove the door from outside. I laughed and yelled something, figuring it was Marcus messing with me. No response, just a couple of hard bangs on the metal. Weird, but I'd been in there forever, so I assumed he was just joking around. I opened the door. No one was there. I stepped out and wandered down the narrow hallway, but instead of heading straight back to the office, I turned left toward a small side parking lot out back where the dumpster was, along with a little outdoor area. As I stepped into the lot, I heard footsteps pounding the asphalt running toward me from somewhere in the dark. Now I knew something was off. I spun around and bolted for the office, and sprinting so fast I nearly face-planted on the concrete, but caught the door handle just in time. I started punching in the code and messed it up instantly. The keypad flashed red. I had to wait 5 seconds for it to reset. All I could hear was my heartbeat, my breathing, and those footsteps thumping out there in the shadows. I jiggled the handle and shouted for Marcus, banging on the door. Suddenly I realized the tables had turned. I was the one outside now, trapped in this terrifying chaos. Through the blinds I could see him over his shoulder. He was on the phone, the red lights blinking on 3 lines. It must have been picked up while I was dealing with my business. I turned and started pounding on the glass, begging him to come over. He hit the hold button, spun his chair around, and raced to the door. He shoved it open. I stumbled inside, and he slammed it shut behind me. Gasping for air, I told him what had just happened. I expected Marcus to freak out, lock the deadbolt, and tell me to call the cops. Nope. Exact opposite. He rolled up his sleeves and stepped out into the cool night air. The guy was lurking at the end of the building where the turn to the restroom corner was. Barefoot, strung out, homeless, a junkie who'd hit rock bottom in our city. I watched from the office doorway as Marcus confronted him, gave him a solid shove, and told him to get lost. The guy took off running. I thought he might have been some serial killer or something, but Marcus brushed it off, saying he was just a drifter. Like I said, Marcus was a tough guy from the streets with a colorful past and a few run-ins with the law. I was damn grateful to have him around every time we worked that office. We ran into that creep a few more times, and honestly, all the wild stuff that went down there. The 7-Eleven across the street getting robbed constantly. Roadside calls where people got shot. even one of our drivers getting caught up in it. And that time we helped a guy escape some shady property by towing his car out of there. Those experiences stuck with me. I just finished my freshman year of college and took a job as a taxi dispatcher at my boyfriend's cousin's taxi company for the first week and a half. I mostly worked day shifts until the owner decided to extend the hours to 24/7, and I was one of the lucky employees who'd be handling 3 out of 4 of those shifts a week. The following week, I worked my first solo night shift. Drivers have to stay up all night chasing fares, which means a lot of work happens in the dark, and it'd just be me. I didn't mind working alone like that since I'd done night shifts at a 24-hour coffee shop before and was used to it. Plus, it was only the 4th or 5th night of the week, so it wasn't too busy. The best part about this job? My boss lets me use the internet to play video games on my laptop from the office desk. I can see the front door, part of the reception, counter, and most of the front windows so I can keep a close eye on what's happening outside. There's also a bell above the door that always alerts me to new customers so I can't be caught off guard, even if I'm deep into a game. On this particular night, I was working with a taxi driver named Milo. Milo's about 6'3" and weighs around 300 pounds. Plus he's got some serious health issues, one of which makes every movement slow and painful. He's definitely not the athletic type, or someone who could easily defend himself or anyone else. Sometime in the early morning hours, between 1:30 and 2 a.m., Milo got a call to pick someone up in town about 15 minutes away. He gathered his stuff and drove off into the night while I stayed in the office, jumping back into my video game. About 15 minutes later, I heard something through my laptop headphones. My mind froze. I could hear heavy, gasping breaths, and, through the reflection in the window, I saw someone sitting in one of the waiting chairs. I stepped toward the doorway connecting the lobby to the office, and there was this guy with a massive rat-tail haircut who'd somehow slipped into the office. He was sitting there, face buried in his hands, panting. He was filthy, sweaty, and looked like he'd just run a marathon. That rat tail should have tipped me off, but I found it more amusing than frightening. A few minutes passed, and I finally worked up the nerve to ask if he needed a taxi. He didn't answer at first. I asked again, and he looked up at me. I took a step back into the office. His face was scratched up, smeared with blood from a gash on his head. I was stunned and immediately offered to help him. He replied, "I'm fine. I don't need help. I just want to go home." I asked if he needed a taxi and where he'd be going. He said he lived about 20 minutes away and wanted Milo to take him. Things started getting weird from there. I radioed Milo to let him know there was a fare waiting at the office and that the guy specifically wanted him. Milo said he'd be another 10 minutes or so. My hand stayed on my phone the whole time, just in case this guy made any sudden moves. Instead of going back into the office, I figured it was safer to stay out front. The 2 big arched windows made it easy to keep an eye on what was happening inside the taxi office. I didn't feel like he was a threat exactly, but he seemed really upset about something. So I wanted to make sure if anything went down, people could see me. I stepped closer to the guy in the front room, and as I got nearer, I noticed he wasn't just bleeding from his head. He had blood on his shoulder and knee too. I asked again if he was okay and offered to call an ambulance. Bad idea. "You don't need to do that," he snapped. "It's not like I killed anybody, right? I didn't kill anyone. Don't do that." I stammered, "I'm sorry, I just noticed you're bleeding a lot and thought maybe you'd want someone to make sure you're okay." I should have kept quiet. He was already worked up. "It's not like I killed anybody," he repeated. "You don't need to call anyone, I just want to go home." "Okay," I said, "but you're bleeding." "It's not like I killed anybody," he cut in. "I swear I didn't kill anybody. Please don't call the cops. I don't need the cops, I just need to go home. I didn't kill anybody." Silence hung between us for a few minutes. Then he noticed the phone clutched in my hand. "I fell," he blurted out. "I fell," he said again. "That's why I'm bleeding. I fell. It's not like I killed anybody." Suddenly he stood up and started pacing. He was getting impatient for his taxi, and I was freaking out because now blood was dripping onto the chair and floor. I kept my phone in hand, and every so often he'd break the silence with another rambling outburst about how he didn't do anything wrong, didn't kill anybody, and I didn't need to call the cops because he was a good person. Finally, Milo radioed that he was 2 minutes away, and I let out a sigh of relief. He pulled up out front, the guy got in, and they drove off. Now I was worried about Milo, so I called the police. I reported what happened, and they tracked the taxi to the guy's house, where they arrested him. Turns out this dude had fled a nearby bar after attacking someone, beat the guy so bad, with what I assume was a pocket knife or something sharp. He'd tripped while running away and stumbled his way to the taxi office. While he was there, the cops had already been looking for him. So, technically, no, he didn't kill anybody, but he'd attacked someone and tried to. I later found out from another driver, Theo, that he knew the guy from high school years back. His name was Rex. That rat tail explained a lot. Rex had a history of violence. He'd also been known to come home drunk and occasionally bash his wife's head in. Whether he was planning to do that tonight, I can't say, but I'm just glad he ended up in the drunk tank that night. His wife was fine, and the guy he stabbed didn't die. At least I assume he didn't, because every now and then I still see Rex walking around town with that glorious rat tail. That means he's not locked up. But seriously, I wish you could see that rat tail. It's a sight to behold. So, I've been driving a lot over the past few years for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes to get to work, other times just to hang out with friends. On weekends, now that I'm 25, I usually end up going to parties most of the time. That means driving to places like bars and clubs, often pretty far from home. One night I was on my way back from a college friend's party, and honestly, I realized I was running low on gas. I debated whether to fill up right then or wait until the next day, but I knew I'd probably forget. So I pulled into one of the local gas stations along the road to top off my tank. While I was paying and waiting for the tank to fill, I noticed how quiet it was around the place. It felt strange because this station's usually busy, especially on a weekend night since it's right on a corner. After the tank was full, I went inside to grab a quick snack. There was a guy standing behind the counter, and I gave him a wave before heading to pick something out. When I brought it back to pay, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The cashier didn't look like your typical gas station worker. In my city, they're supposed to wear uniforms, but this guy was in a black hoodie and sweatpants. I didn't want to pry, plus I was too tired to care, so I just told him I only wanted the snack. He said, $2, without even scanning it. I pulled $2 out of my wallet and handed it over, and he just stuffed the cash into his pocket. Confused, I muttered a good night and started walking out. That's when I heard someone yell, "Help me!" I spun around and saw the guy behind the counter pointing a gun at me, telling me to ignore it and keep moving. Without a second thought, I bolted out of there, yanked the pump out of my car, and floored it. As I sped off, I called the cops, explaining what had happened and which gas station I'd just left. Turns out they showed up not long after, but the guy I'd seen was long gone by then. The real cashier had been tied up behind one of the dumpsters. That's who I'd heard screaming for help. He'd been shot in the leg and knocked out with a pipe, which explained why I'd seen that other guy with a gun. God only knows what would have happened if I'd confronted him or called the cops right there on the spot. I'll admit, sometimes I'm a bit of a coward, so I wasn't about to play hero or do anything reckless. A few weeks later, I heard about a couple whose car got stolen while they were pumping gas at another station in the next town over. They never got it back, even after searching. I'm still not sure if it was the same guy, since crime's been pretty high around where I live lately. What I went through might have been one of the worst incidents, or at least close to it, in my area. That gas station shut down for a week or so before reopening. Months have passed, and I still don't know if the police ever caught the guy or if he's still out there. The description I gave wasn't much help since he was wearing a hoodie and a mask. It just goes to show that even the most harmless-looking places can turn dangerous, especially at night. These days, I carry a pocket knife whenever I'm out after dark, just in case. As for me and my family, we don't go near that gas station anymore. I'm still too paranoid about what happened. This happened back in 2010 when I was working at a hotel in the suburbs. It was a great place when I first started, peaceful, quiet, and a good gig to kick things off. I was juggling 2 part-time roles, front desk staff and night auditor. For those not in the hotel biz, night auditing basically means wrapping up the day's work on the computer during the graveyard shift. I'd just gotten promoted to a daytime position, with 1 week left at the front desk before switching to a Monday to Friday schedule. That night started out like any other, around 3 a.m., pretty dead. Then I got a phone call. Some guy, sounded like he was in his 20s, started chatting me up. I had to say my name when answering the phone. It was protocol. So naturally, he picked up on it and got personal fast. "Do you have a boyfriend? Want to grab a drink sometime?" Stuff like that. Harmless enough, but I told him I was hanging up because I had work to do. He didn't give me his name. Instead, he said, "Why don't I just call myself Tom?" I ended the call and finished my shift. The next night, around 3:30 a.m., he called again. Tom started with the drink invite, but I brushed him off and hung up. He didn't stop, called back 5 times that night, each time getting cruder, just trying to keep me on the line. The last call ended with him saying, "I saw you like karaoke, I'm into that too. We should hang out sometime." Turns out he'd found me on Twitter. A few nights earlier, I'd gone out with friends and posted about it. I asked how he got my full name, but he dodged the question. I hung up again, and that was it for the night. Freaked out, I deleted my Twitter, my Foursquare, anything he could use to track me. When my boss rolled in at 7 a.m., I told him everything. We looped in the general manager, and the security guy logged it in his report. I only had 2 night shifts a week, thank goodness, but when I came back the next week, so did he. The call started at 3 a.m. again and went on for about an hour. This time, though, Tom was different. Angry. He was pissed I'd deleted my account, saying he couldn't keep tabs on me anymore or make sure I wasn't cheating on him. I told him I wasn't answering calls anymore. My security guy would handle them from now on. The line went quiet for maybe 10 seconds, then he screamed, "I'll be with you whether you like it or not. I'm coming to get you," and hung up. I called the cops right away. Lucky for me, the security guard was there, so I wasn't totally alone, but man, that night dragged on. The police showed up in minutes. I rang my night manager, who'd left at 11 p.m., and he tried calming me down. One of the cops was kind enough to stick around until my shift ended. After that, I told my boss that even though I had 1 more week of nights, I couldn't and wouldn't do it. Thankfully, they got it. I switched to day shifts early and sent an email to the team saying any calls asking for me should go straight to the GM. Things died down after that. The security guy fielded a few more calls from Tom over the next week or so. Told him I'd quit because of him. That seemed to do the trick, and the calls stopped. I've worked a bunch of different jobs before landing the one I have now. which I genuinely love. One of those gigs was with a cleaning company. We'd get sent out to various businesses around the area, mostly office buildings and bus depots, to tidy them up. Sometimes a whole crew would go, and other times it'd just be one of us. I remember this one office building in particular where I was assigned to clean. I'd work late into the night, and I actually liked the night shift. No traffic on the way there or back, and it felt good to just get in, do my job, and leave, without any hassle. That said, it wasn't something I'd want to do forever, but it was interesting for a while. At this office building, I'd always show up alone. It wasn't a huge place, just 3 floors, but I'd be the only person in the whole building. They gave me a checklist of everything I needed to do, and once I was done, I could head out. I had a key to get in, and I remember the first time. I walked inside. All the lights were off. I'd start on the first floor, vacuuming, wiping down the bathrooms, disinfecting, and cleaning a few other spots. It probably took me about 2 hours to finish that floor. Then I'd move up to the second floor. About 20 minutes into vacuuming up there, I thought I heard the elevator. I stopped and switched off the vacuum for a second. Sure enough, the elevator was moving, heading up to the 3rd floor. I was maybe 30 feet from it, and all of a sudden I felt a little uneasy. I was certain no one else was supposed to be there. Thinking back, though, I wasn't totally sure. If someone else was around, wouldn't I have been told? I didn't want to go check it out, so I just went back to cleaning. I finished vacuuming and moved on to the bathrooms on that floor. While I was wiping down an office window, I heard a noise on the same floor I was on. My heart started racing. I told myself not to freak out, but I couldn't bring myself to look directly toward where the sound came from. I kept working, and for a few minutes, it was quiet again. But then I heard more noises. At that point, it was all I could think about, even while I was cleaning. I decided to walk toward the sound. Maybe there was a simple explanation. At first, I didn't see anything, but then I heard it again, sharper this time, louder and closer than before. Out of nowhere, a man bolted from behind a wall, sprinting down the hallway toward the stairs. I only saw him for about 3 seconds. I couldn't make out much, but I had this gut feeling he wasn't supposed to be there. How'd he even get in? No idea. I went over to the stairwell and opened the door. Nothing. No sound. No sign of him. He must have gone up or down, though I didn't think he'd had enough time to reach another floor. I had this nagging sense he was still inside. I shouted, asking who he was, but got no answer. Then I yelled that no one was allowed in the building and he needed to leave or I'd call the cops. Right after I said that, I heard a door open and slam shut from the 1st floor. He hadn't responded, but I figured he was down there and leaving. I stayed by the stairs, listening for a couple of minutes, then went back to finish the 2nd floor. It didn't take long before I headed up to the 3rd. Up there, I followed the same routine as the other floors. Vacuuming, bathrooms, the usual. It was all pretty standard and I didn't hear anything else. Things went smoothly. I knew I'd have to report that someone had been in the building, but I was pretty sure the guy had left. Just as I was finishing the 3rd floor, though, I was in one of the hallways when I heard footsteps behind me. I had no clue how he'd gotten back in. The steps were closing in fast, maybe 20 feet away. I turned around, caught a glimpse of him for a split second, then spun back and bolted for the stairs. The elevator wasn't an option. I sprinted down the stairwell as fast as I could, hearing him chasing after me about a flight behind. I couldn't see him, but he was close. I pushed myself to the limit, finally hitting the 1st floor and bursting out the front door. I ran to my van in the parking lot and got inside, but some of my gear was still in the building. I called the police, and my boss then waited in the van until the cops showed up. When they arrived, they went in and came out about 10 minutes later with the guy in custody. I was so relieved they'd caught him. After talking to the police and my boss, I went back inside, grabbed my stuff, and left. It was a pretty terrifying experience. I kept thinking about what might have happened if he'd caught up to me when he was closing in from behind. Would he have tried to hurt me? The fact that he chased me made me think, yeah, probably. I'm just glad I got out of there. This happened in the fall of 1993 when I was 20 years old. At the time, it was before I started college, and I was working the night shift at the material prep room of a plastics factory. I was the only woman in the department, and my male coworkers initially doubted I could handle the job. But I proved myself and earned their respect. It was tough work, but the upside was it got me into the best shape of my life. That was also around the time I broke up with my abusive boyfriend. He was emotionally and physically violent and a drunk to boot. That fact, more than anything, might have been why I ended up in this situation in the first place. I'd just gotten off work, and it was about 1:30 a.m. My car was low on gas, so I pulled into a local station to fill up. While I was pumping, a woman about my age approached me, looking anxious and scared. She said she'd been at her boyfriend's place, they'd fought, and she'd walked to the gas station to use the payphone and call a friend for a ride. On her way there, a car had pulled up beside her as she walked, and the guys inside started whistling and harassing her. With a slight nod, she pointed to a car parked near the station's dumpster. I saw a big, pale green car, like a Caddy or a Lincoln, with at least 2 or 3 shadowy figures inside. She said they'd threatened her, and she was too terrified to call her friend and wait. She looked put together, neatly dressed, and didn't seem high or drunk or anything like that, just genuinely rattled and panicked. So I didn't even hesitate. I'd finished pumping gas and told her to hop in, that I'd drive her home. At that hour on a weeknight, there was barely any traffic, so I pulled out of the station and asked where she lived. She kept twisting around in her seat, checking if that car was behind us. When I told her to buckle up, she ignored me and kept looking. I figured she was just scared. A few blocks later, though, I noticed her glancing around my car. Then she started asking about money. Where's my wallet? Where's my purse? I need cash. You need to give me some money. My stomach sank. I had this woman in my car and now she was going to rob me. But when I thought about it, robbery didn't quite add up. I was driving a beat-up 1985 Chevette wearing my work clothes, an old t-shirt, jeans, and combat boots. I didn't look like someone with money, mostly because I wasn't. She twisted around again and started yelling, "They're there, they're there." She didn't sound scared anymore. I checked my rear view and sure enough, that pale green car was right behind me. Then she started giggling, bouncing in her seat. She laughed like a maniac, popped open the glove box, peeked in the back for a bag or wallet, and began telling me all the awful things those guys were going to do to me. "If you're smart," she said, "you'd drive to the police station." Honestly, if I'd been really smart, I would have called the cops from the gas station and waited with her until they showed up. That would have been the sensible thing. Unfortunately, none of that crossed my mind until right then. I was furious. 3 things hit me at once. There was an intersection ahead with cars waiting to cross. The light had just turned yellow, and I had a spare box cutter stashed in the driver's side door pocket. Oh, and that lunatic still hadn't buckled her seatbelt. I didn't think. I floored it through the yellow just as it turned red. I glanced back to see if the green car was still behind me, but the cross traffic had started moving, and they hadn't caught up. Then the screaming started. I slammed on the brakes and that nutcase smashed into the dash and windshield with a solid, satisfying crack. She bounced back into the passenger seat. I whipped out the box cutter, pointed it at her face, and yelled, something completely unhinged, I don't remember exactly, but it was along the lines of, "Get out of my car before I cut your face off and make you eat it." The combo of my wild screaming and the box cutter did the trick. She fumbled blindly for the door handle, flung it open, and I started shoving and punching her until she spilled out onto the curb. I peeled out, took the next turn with a screech, passenger door still swinging open, and zigzagged a few more corners, terrified that green car might catch up. After a bit, I stopped to close the door, then drove across town and hit the highway home. I'd been on the highway for maybe 5 minutes when the shaking started. I pulled over to calm down, then drove the rest of the way. When I got home, I told my sister, who I was crashing with temporarily after the breakup, everything that had just happened. She hugged me tight while simultaneously yelling at me for being so stupid and not going to the cops. I'd never been so happy to get chewed out in my life. Right now, I'm taking a break from school to intern at a big company. The company's headquarters is in a smaller city, and I'm working at an even smaller location just north of it. I live in a quiet suburban town, in a gated apartment complex, in a really nice area with almost no crime. I woke up and got ready for work like usual, but when I got to my car, not only was it iced over, I also noticed the gas was nearly empty. I decided not to risk it and figured I'd fill up the tank before heading to work, once the front and back windows thawed enough for me to see. I drove a block down the street to my usual gas station. I pulled up to the farthest pump on the right and hopped out. While I was swiping my card and doing all that fun stuff, another car pulled in. Honestly, I didn't get a good look at it. It wasn't shiny or new, but I barely paid attention until it stopped at the pump across from me. I could hear the other drivers swipe their card and punch in their PIN. I was freezing and just trying to hurry up. I turned to put the nozzle in my car and stood there for a minute feeling pretty dumb. Then I decided to turn my back. I didn't want any interaction with whoever it was, so I just pretended no one was there. After filling up, I pulled the nozzle out and stayed in the same spot, not even glancing up. I finished the transaction and grabbed my receipt as it printed. While it was printing, I casually looked up and nearly collapsed right there on the pavement. A man was peering around the corner of the pump, staring straight at me. His eyes were ice cold and unrelenting. He didn't blink or move, but his gaze grew more intense by the second. There was something animalistic about the way he stared, like I was a deer being stalked by a mountain lion. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my instincts screamed at me to run. All of this happened in just a few seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. I quickly opened my car door. As I did, the man tilted his head to the side, trying to peek inside my car. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now I wonder if he was checking to see if I was alone. I deliberately blocked his view of the interior with my body, then slammed the door shut and locked it immediately. So like I mentioned earlier, my car had been almost completely iced over. By now, the front and back windows were clear, but the side windows were still mostly frozen. There was just one thin strip of clarity on the driver's side window from when I'd cracked it open earlier to try and scrape it. As I fumbled to buckle my seatbelt, I glanced to my left. He was still there, still staring, but now he was closer. I could see more of him now than before. He was tall, with dark hair and a muscular build. He was definitely bigger than me, probably a few years older too. Without those eyes, I might have even said he was good-looking. But those eyes, they just haunted me. I decided to do the smart thing and get the hell out of there as fast as I could. I didn't want him to have any chance of following me. Even though my workplace is pretty secure, I didn't want him knowing where I went. I still don't know if that guy was just some creep or something darker, but I never want to find out.